They were trained to see prisoners not as men, but as practice targets. Living, breathing, screaming practice targets. We're talking about thousands of Japanese soldiers who were systematically conditioned to murder unarmed captives with cold steel. Not in the heat of battle, but as a graduation ceremony, as a rite of passage, as lunchtime entertainment, a practice so widespread, so institutionalized, that it became part of the standard training curriculum across the Imperial Japanese Army, so horrifying that veterans who participated couldn't speak of it for 50 years afterward, and many took the secret to their graves. We're going to show you how this happened, what turned ordinary farm boys from rural Japan into men capable of bayoneting tied prisoners to death, and why the psychological machinery behind it was just as monstrous as the killings themselves. And here's something most people don't know. The Japanese bayonet wasn't just a weapon, it was a philosophy, a 400-year-old tradition that the Imperial Army would weaponize into one of the most systematic programs of cruelty in modern military history. The Japanese bayonet, known as the Type 30 Yukon, was longer than almost any other military bayonet in the world. Over 15 inches of cold steel attached to an Arisaka rifle that was already among the longest service rifles of World War II. When fixed, the combined length exceeded 66 inches, taller than many of the soldiers carrying it. This wasn't an accident of design. This was deliberate. Japanese military doctrine, drawing on samurai traditions and the cult of the cold weapon, believed that a soldier who could close with the enemy and kill him with steel proved his spiritual superiority. The bullet was for cowards. The bayonet was for warriors. Generals who had studied in France and Germany before the war returned to Japan, convinced that the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 to 1905 had proved the supremacy of spirit over firepower. They watched as Japanese infantry, charging with fixed bayonets, broke Russian lines that should have held. They concluded, wrongly, catastrophically, that Yamato Damashi, the Japanese fighting spirit, could overcome any technological disadvantage. By the 1930s, this philosophy had hardened into doctrine, and that doctrine demanded soldiers willing to use the bayonet without hesitation, without mercy, without the slightest tremor of human feeling. By 1937, when full-scale war erupted in China, the Imperial Japanese Army faced a problem its commanders had not anticipated. The young men flooding into the ranks weren't natural killers. They were rice farmers from Tohoku, fishermen's sons from Kyushu, schoolboys from Osaka who had never harmed anything larger than a cricket. Conventional military training could teach them to march, to shoot, to obey, but it could not teach them to drive 15 inches of steel into another human being's body, not at the speed and scale the army needed. The high command needed a solution, and what they devised was something the world had never seen before: the systematic use of living human beings as bayonet training material. This wasn't a war crime committed in the chaos of battle by undisciplined troops. This was policy, curriculum, a graduation requirement. The first organized bayonet training programs using live prisoners began in earnest during the Second Sino-Japanese War. Captured Chinese soldiers, suspected guerrillas, and sometimes simply civilians swept up in raids were brought to training areas behind the lines. They were tied to wooden posts. Sometimes their hands were bound behind their backs. Sometimes they were blindfolded. Sometimes they weren't, and the trainees had to look into their eyes as they killed them. Veterans who later confessed described the scene with chilling consistency. The prisoners would be lined up, often 6 or 8 at a time. Officers would lecture the assembled recruits on proper bayonet technique, the angle of the thrust, the twist of the blade to ensure a fatal wound, the withdrawal that prevented the body from gripping the steel. Then, one by one, the recruits would be ordered forward to perform what was euphemistically called the test of courage. Refusal was not an option. We'll explain what happened to those who tried to refuse, and the answer reveals just how mechanically the system was designed to break human resistance. The recruit who hesitated was beaten. Not metaphorically, physically beaten by his sergeant, often in front of the prisoner he had failed to kill. He would be slapped, punched, struck with the flat of an officer's sword. He would be screamed at, called a coward, told he had dishonored his ancestors and his emperor, and then he would be ordered forward again. The pressure was overwhelming because it operated on multiple levels simultaneously. There was the immediate physical violence from his superiors. There was the social humiliation in front of his comrades. There was the cultural weight of failing to perform when ordered, in a society where group conformity was paramount. And there was a more subtle pressure that veterans only described decades later, the knowledge that everyone else was going to do it. If you didn't, you would be the only one. You would be marked. Your career, your family's reputation, possibly your life, would be destroyed. So the recruit thrust the bayonet forward, and once he had done it once, the system had him. He could no longer claim moral superiority over the men around him. He was one of them now, bound by shared atrocity into a unit that the army could send anywhere, ordered to do anything. The technique itself was taught with sickening precision. Japanese bayonet manuals, actual published documents from the Imperial Army, specified that the thrust should enter below the ribs and angle upward, piercing the diaphragm and reaching the heart or major vessels. A second technique targeted the throat, severing the airway and the carotid artery simultaneously. The blade was to be twisted 90 degrees before withdrawal, ensuring that the wound would not close behind it and that the victim would die of internal hemorrhage if not killed instantly. Recruits practiced these movements thousands of times on straw dummies before being given their first living target. The transition was deliberate. By the time a soldier faced a tied prisoner, his muscles had memorized the motion. His mind only had to give permission, and the entire training apparatus existed to ensure that permission was given. Now, let's talk about what made this different from the bayonet training of every other army in the world. Because every army taught bayonet fighting. The Americans, the British, the Germans, the Soviets. All of them had bayonet drills, bayonet manuals, bayonet philosophies. What separated the Japanese system was the deliberate institutionalized use of human beings as training aids. There is no equivalent in any other major military of the 20th century. American GIs practiced on burlap dummies stuffed with straw. German recruits stabbed wooden posts. Soviet soldiers thrust at hanging sandbags. Only the Japanese, alone among the great powers, brought living men into the training ground and ordered their recruits to kill them as a step in the curriculum. This is not Western propaganda. This is documented in Japanese military records, in post-war tribunals, in the confessions of the soldiers themselves who came forward in the 1980s and 1990s, often elderly men dying with the weight of what they had done, finally willing to speak. One veteran, who only gave his testimony anonymously, described his first bayonet killing in detail. He was 19 years old. He had been in China for less than a month. His unit was assembled in a field outside a village, and 4 Chinese men were brought forward and tied to stakes. The men were, in his words, ordinary people, farmers. They could have been my uncles. His sergeant told him to fix bayonets. He fixed his bayonet. The sergeant pointed to one of the prisoners and ordered him forward. He walked forward. The prisoner looked at him. He looked at the prisoner. He thrust the bayonet. He missed the heart. The prisoner screamed. He thrust again. The prisoner kept screaming. By the third thrust, the prisoner had stopped screaming, but his body was still moving. The sergeant came forward, took the rifle from him, and finished the killing with a single practiced motion. Then he handed the rifle back and ordered the recruit to do better next time. There would be a next time. There would be many next times. The veteran said he stopped counting after 30. The psychological transformation that the Imperial Army was engineering had a name in their internal documents. They called it Seishin Kyoiku, spiritual education. The idea was that the recruit had to be remade. His civilian self, with its squeamishness and its sentimental attachments to ordinary morality, had to die. In its place would emerge the imperial soldier, hardened, obedient, capable of any act in service of the emperor. The bayonet killing was the central rite of this transformation. It was the moment after which the recruit could not return. He had crossed a line that civilian life recognized as absolute, and on the other side of that line, the army owned him completely. Everything that came afterward, the looting, the burning of villages, the mass executions, the things that happened in Nanking and 1,000 other places, became possible because the foundational act had already been performed. He had killed an unarmed, tied, helpless human being on command. After that, what couldn't he do? The training was designed to disable specific psychological mechanisms that protect human beings from killing other humans. Modern military psychology, beginning with the work of S.L.A. Marshall after the war, and refined by researchers like Dave Grossman, has identified what's called the natural resistance to killing. Most human beings, even soldiers in combat, have powerful inhibitions against killing other humans at close range. These inhibitions can be overcome, but doing so causes lasting psychological damage. The Japanese bayonet training program was, perhaps inadvertently, one of the most effective systems ever devised for systematically dismantling these inhibitions. By forcing recruits to kill at close range, with cold steel, looking into their victims' faces while their comrades watched, the army produced soldiers who had been stripped of the moral and emotional protections that ordinarily prevent atrocity. The cost, as we'll see, was carried not just by the victims, but by the killers themselves for the rest of their lives. The bayonet was not the only edged weapon in this campaign of institutionalized cruelty. Japanese officers carried the shingunto, a sword based on the traditional katana, and these blades became infamous tools of execution. Officers were expected to demonstrate their warrior spirit by personally beheading prisoners. Some officers kept tallies. 2 Japanese lieutenants, Toshiaki Mukai and Tsuyoshi Noda, became briefly famous in 1937 for what Japanese newspapers called the contest to behead 100 men. The Tokyo Nichi Shimbun reported on the contest as if it were a sporting event, publishing updates as the 2 officers raced through the killing fields outside Nanking. By the time they reached Nanking, Mukai claimed 106 beheadings and Noda claimed 105. They agreed to start a new contest with a target of 150. After the war, both men were tried by the Chinese government. Both were convicted. Both were executed by firing squad in 1948. They went to their deaths, still claiming that the original newspaper reports had exaggerated their actions, but the photographic evidence and the testimony of witnesses left no doubt about what they had done. The bayonet squads operated throughout the territories Japan occupied, in the Philippines, in Malaya, in Burma, in the Dutch East Indies, in New Guinea, in China. Wherever the Imperial Army went, the bayonet went with it, and where the bayonet went, the killings followed. Allied prisoners of war became frequent victims. American, Australian, British, Indian and Filipino soldiers captured by Japanese forces faced the very real possibility that their captors would use them for bayonet practice. The Bataan Death March of 1942, in which approximately 75,000 Filipino and American prisoners were forced to march 60 miles to prison camps, included numerous bayonet killings. Japanese guards bayoneted prisoners who fell behind, who tried to drink from streams without permission, who showed any sign of weakness or defiance. Survivors estimated that between 5,000 and 18,000 prisoners died on the march. The exact number will never be known because many of the dead were left where they fell, their bodies decomposing in tropical heat or eaten by scavengers before they could be counted. Now, let's talk about something that historians are still trying to fully document: the bayonet killings that occurred during the Rape of Nanking in December 1937 and January 1938. When Japanese forces captured the Chinese capital, 6 weeks of organized atrocity followed. Estimates of the dead range from 40,000 in the most conservative Japanese accounts to over 300,000 in Chinese records. Among these deaths, bayonet killings featured heavily. Photographs from the period, taken by Japanese soldiers themselves and later recovered, show piles of bodies with bayonet wounds. They show executions in progress. They show Japanese soldiers posing with their bayonets next to prisoners about to be killed. These photographs were not propaganda. The soldiers took them as souvenirs. They sent them home in letters. They pasted them into albums. The casual nature of the documentation reveals just how thoroughly the killings had been normalized within Japanese military culture. Killing a tied Chinese prisoner with a bayonet was, for many Japanese soldiers, no more remarkable than a Western tourist photographing himself at a famous landmark. The Yangtze River became, for a few weeks, a slaughterhouse. Japanese troops would line up Chinese prisoners along the riverbank, often hundreds at a time. Some were shot, many were bayoneted. The bodies were pushed into the water, where the current carried them downstream. American missionaries and European businessmen who had remained in Nanking documented what they saw. John Rabe, a German Nazi Party member who ran the International Safety Zone in Nanking, wrote in his diary about the bayoneting of civilians, the use of women for sexual atrocities, followed by bayonet executions, and the systematic killing of any Chinese male of military age, regardless of whether he had been a soldier. Rabe, and the historical irony cuts deep here, repeatedly used his Nazi Party credentials to try to stop the killings, on the grounds that Germany was Japan's ally, and these atrocities reflected badly on the alliance. He had limited success. The killings continued. Inside the bayonet squads themselves, a brutal hierarchy operated. Veteran soldiers, who had performed their own first killings months or years earlier, became enforcers and instructors. They watched the new recruits with predatory attention, looking for any sign of weakness. The recruit who vomited after his first killing was singled out for additional training. The recruit who showed pity was beaten. The recruit who tried to kill cleanly and quickly to spare his victim was lectured on the importance of the proper technique, which was deliberately designed to cause maximum suffering, because suffering proved the killer's spiritual superiority. This is a detail that does not appear in most popular accounts, but it is documented in the testimony of Japanese veterans themselves. The bayonet killings were not supposed to be quick. They were supposed to be theatrical. The screams of the victim were considered evidence that the killer had done his job correctly. The trainers, the sergeants and officers who ran the bayonet schools, occupied a peculiar psychological position. Many of them were, in civilian life before the war, ordinary men, schoolteachers, shopkeepers, postal clerks. They had been called up, indoctrinated, sent to China, made to kill, and then promoted to make others kill. By the time they were running training programs, some of them had personally executed dozens or hundreds of prisoners. They had become connoisseurs of killing, and they brought a craftsman's pride to teaching their craft. After the war, when some of these men were prosecuted, their testimony revealed a psychological terrain that prosecutors and historians struggled to map. They did not show remorse, exactly. They did not show pleasure either. They showed something more disturbing, a kind of professional satisfaction, the same satisfaction a master carpenter might feel discussing the proper technique for a complex joint. The killing had become a craft. The craft had absorbed the man. Now let's examine what happened to the soldiers who came home, because most of them did. The Imperial Japanese Army that surrendered in August 1945 included millions of men who had participated, in one form or another, in the bayonet squads, the executions, the atrocities. They returned to a defeated and devastated Japan. They returned to wives and parents and children who had no idea what they had done overseas. They returned to a society that, in the post-war period, made a deliberate decision not to ask. American occupation authorities, focused on rebuilding Japan as a Cold War ally, allowed most of the killers to disappear back into civilian life. The Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal prosecuted senior leadership. Some lower-ranking officers were tried by Allied tribunals in the territories where atrocities had occurred, but the rank-and-file soldiers, the men who had actually held the bayonets and pushed them into bound bodies, went home almost universally unpunished. What followed was a generation-long silence. Japanese veterans did not speak of the bayonet killings. Their wives did not ask. Their children grew up not knowing. The men carried what they had done in private, and they carried it in ways that left visible marks. Japanese psychiatrists and historians who later studied veterans of the China campaigns reported elevated rates of alcoholism, domestic violence, depression, and suicide. Veterans had nightmares. They drank to make the nightmares stop. They beat their wives and children when the drinking didn't work. They died younger than the civilian male population. The cost of the bayonet training, paid first by the victims, was paid for a second time by the killers themselves, distributed across decades of damaged lives and damaged families. In the 1980s and 1990s, something began to change. Some Japanese veterans, now in their 70s and 80s, began to speak. The most prominent of these was Shiro Azuma, a former soldier who published his diary from the Nanking campaign and gave detailed interviews about what he had witnessed and done. Azuma described bayonet killings, beheadings, the rape and murder of Chinese women, the casual cruelty of his unit. For breaking his silence, Azuma was sued by other Japanese veterans who claimed his accounts defamed them. Right-wing nationalists harassed him. He died in 2006, never having received the kind of public reckoning he had hoped for. But other veterans followed his example. A small group, organized through an association called Chukiren, began publicly testifying about what they had done in China. Their testimony, video recorded and archived, now constitutes one of the most important historical sources for understanding what the bayonet squads actually did. One Chukiren veteran, in his confession, described the moment he understood what had been done to him. He was visiting his grandson at school. The grandson, perhaps 6 years old, was learning to use scissors. The boy struggled to cut a piece of paper, his small hands working awkwardly. The grandfather watched, and suddenly he was back in China, decades earlier, his own hands working a bayonet that wouldn't pull free from a prisoner's ribcage. The contrast was unbearable. He realized that the small, awkward hands of his grandson were the hands he himself had once had, the hands of someone who had not yet been taught to kill. And he realized that the army had taken those hands and reshaped them into something else. He went home from the school visit, sat down, and wept for hours. Then he wrote his confession. The Imperial Japanese Army was not unique in committing atrocities. Every army in the Second World War committed atrocities. American troops killed surrendering Japanese soldiers and collected body parts as souvenirs. British and Commonwealth forces committed massacres in Malaya. Soviet troops carried out mass rapes across Eastern Europe and Manchuria. German forces, of course, conducted the Holocaust. But the Japanese bayonet training program occupies its own particular place in this dark catalogue because of its institutional character. The killings were not done in spite of the army's discipline. They were done because of the army's discipline. They were not the failure of training, they were the success of training. They were not the unauthorized actions of rogue units. They were standard curriculum, executed across the entire force, in front of officers who recorded the proceedings in unit diaries that survive to this day. This systematic quality is what distinguishes the Japanese case. It was not a breakdown. It was a design. The aftermath of these killings shaped Japan's relationship with its own history in ways that continue to cause international tension today. Visits by Japanese prime ministers to the Yasukuni Shrine, where the spirits of war criminals are enshrined alongside ordinary war dead, regularly provoke diplomatic crises with China and South Korea. Japanese textbooks have repeatedly been criticized for sanitizing or omitting accounts of the bayonet killings, the comfort women's system, and other atrocities. A determined nationalist movement within Japan continues to deny that the killings happened at the scale that historical evidence demonstrates. Comfort women are explained away as voluntary prostitutes. Nanking is described as ordinary urban warfare. The Bayonet training program, when it is mentioned at all, is framed as the actions of individual bad apples rather than institutional policy. Against this denial stands the documentary record, the photographs, the diaries, the orders, the confessions, the testimony of survivors on both sides, and the slow, painful work of historians who continue to insist that what happened be remembered as it actually was. The victims, of course, deserve the final word. Estimates of how many people died in Japanese bayonet killings during the Asia-Pacific War vary enormously because the killings were so widespread and so casually conducted that no one was keeping count. The total number of deaths from Japanese atrocities across the war years is estimated by mainstream historians at between 6 million and 10 million people, the vast majority of them Chinese civilians, with significant numbers also from Korea, the Philippines, Indochina, the Dutch East Indies, and other occupied territories. Of these, the proportion killed specifically by bayonet is impossible to determine precisely, but veterans' testimonies and survivor accounts suggest the number runs into the hundreds of thousands at minimum. Each of these deaths represents a human being who was tied to a post or knelt in the dirt or stood in a line, looking at a Japanese soldier with a long blade fixed to a long rifle, and watched that soldier walk forward. Each of them died because a vast institutional machine had been constructed to require their deaths, not for any military objective, but as a step in the conditioning of someone else. There is a photograph that survives from the period. It shows a young Japanese soldier, no more than 20 years old, standing over a Chinese prisoner. The prisoner is on his knees. The soldier's bayonet is fixed. The soldier is looking at the camera. He is smiling. We don't know the soldier's name. We don't know whether he survived the war. We don't know what he became, if he survived, or how he carried what he had done. We don't know the prisoner's name either, or who waited for him at home, or whether anyone waited for him at home. We know only that the photograph exists, that it was taken as a souvenir, that someone thought it worth preserving. The photograph is part of the historical record now. It will outlast all of us. The smile on the soldier's face is, perhaps, the most disturbing element of the entire image, because it forces us to confront the fact that the man holding the bayonet was not a monster from a fairy tale. He was a young man who had been taught, very thoroughly and very effectively, that what he was doing was correct. That is the achievement of the Japanese bayonet squads. That is what they made. The horror was not the bayonet. The horror was the system that placed the bayonet in his hands, that walked him forward, that taught him to smile. If you've made it this far, type horror in the comments. Tell us, in the comments below, whether you believe a society can ever fully reckon with what its soldiers were ordered to do, or whether some chapters of history can only be recorded, never resolved. Now, go watch this next video, where we explore another dark chapter of World War II history that the textbooks left out.